welcome, Tom, for another short interview. For today, I prepared a couple of questions, and the first one is, in several of your previous videos, you mentioned that we are co-creators of the reality we experience. You mainly focused on three different aspects of co-creation. The first one being interpretation. So two people might have the same experience, but based on their interpretation, their perspective of this experience can be totally different. So the second one would be interactions. So by the way we interact with other people, we influence their reaction. And if we treat the others with disrespect and negativity, we get a different result than if we treat them with love and kindness. I guess most people could go along with these first two aspects of co-creating our reality, but I would like to focus today on the third aspect, which is intent. It is a core element of Yamamoto theory that we modify future probabilities with our intent. Anybody who considers this idea as a new age with wishful thinking might want to take a look into the almost 30 years of research at the University of Princeton. Their Princeton Engineering Alumni Research Lab conducted physics experiments from 1979 till 2007, showing how random processes can be influenced just by having a person focus their intent on a particular outcome. Now, if this works in a physics lab, it most likely also applies to our everyday life. And I have experienced these consequences of my intent being reflected by reality myself. Many people who learn about this concept try to use their conscious mind or intellect to manifest something they wish for, but it often does not work so well. You differentiate between intents that come from the intellectual level and those which come from the being level. Could you briefly explain the difference between these two levels and also elaborate on why intents coming from the being level are so much more effective?
Okay, well, I certainly can. Another name that we could give this rather than being level, because the being level is, I generally say it's the core of you. It's who you are at the core. And people think about that, but that's kind of abstract and it's hard to get your arms around it. So let me put it in a little different way. This is the intuitive level. This is the level where you process information without the intellect. Now, that will also seem kind of abstract until I mention some examples that people do all the time. For example, touch typing. When you type, you keyboard, I guess typing is the old word, when you keyboard, which is the new word, you don't really look at your fingers. You just move your fingers wherever they need to go in order to type what it is you want to type. And if you used your intellect to do that, well, then it would be much slower. You'd have to say, oh, let's see, where's the E? Oh, yes, top row right there. And then you'd hit it with a finger. And then where's the T? That's using your intellect to find each key. But if you just know where it is intuitively, now you can type very quickly. 60 words a minute is not all that uncommon for people who practice. If you use your intellect to hunt and peck, then even if you're really good at hunting and pecking, you probably won't break 10 words a minute. It's a very slow, inefficient process. Well, when you touch typing, you're working through an intuitive level, not an intellectual level. When athletes perform, these are good athletes, let's say, that are good enough to get into the Olympics, they will tell you that who wins and who loses depends more on mindset than it does on, how long you train. Because all those athletes in the Olympics train lots and lots of hours. The winners are because they can get their mind focused properly. And that's because when you're doing whatever you're doing, throwing a javelin or leaping over things or whatever your event is, if you can put all of your focus in the intuitive space to where you just do it, and you're not thinking, okay, I got to hold that spear right here, that javelin, and then I got to go back on my right foot and then forward on my left foot. And if you're thinking about all that stuff, you'll never be very good at it. It just has to happen on its own. That's in intuitive space. The intellect sits down, is quiet and lets the intuitive system just flow through what it does. So we do that lots of ways. And in fact, anything that is complicated, anything that has more than real simple step or two, you will do so much more effectively and efficiently if you do it from the intuitive state. Well, the intuitive state is like a being level. That's the being level. We're not intellectual. We're not thinking about it. We're just doing it. Okay, well, that's the space that you need to get in if you're going to use your focused intent to modify things. So that's kind of the mental space you're in. Other than that, you need to have a quiet mind, a mind that's not constantly being interrupted, but one that you can focus 100% on what you're doing without interruption. For that, we learn to meditate. All meditation is learning to quiet your mind. That's basically the whole point of meditation, that you can sit and have no thoughts in your mind. To be in a state of no intellect is the no thoughts. And if you can do that to where you could sit there for a half hour, an hour, and not have any thoughts, interrupt your silence, interrupt your thinking, then you have a nice low noise consciousness. It's not being interrupted. So that's the second thing that's really important. Then the third thing is if you have to take that low noise and focus it on a very particular thing and hold that focus. Stay focused on that with no interruptions. Okay, so now if you can do those things, then you will be successful at using your intent to modify future probability. So it has to happen in an intuitive space, not an intellectual space. An intellectual space intention is what we call a wish. Oh, I wish the sun would shine tomorrow. That's just a wish. And as we all know, wishes generally don't come true. There's very little power in making a wish. But in that intuitive space, you begin to modify future probability. Again, the future is not a done deal. It's just probable. And if you use your intent, you can make it a little more probable or a little less probable if it naturally has some uncertainty. If there is no uncertainty about it, then you're not going to modify it. You're not going to change it. I know that right now my car is in my garage. That's where I left it. I know it's sitting there. And if I try to make it be someplace else, I'm not going to be successful at that because the probability that it might be someplace else is very low. You see, there's very little uncertainty as to where it is. So changing that will be very hard because it's a 1,000,000 to 1 that it's someplace else. Therefore, a very hard thing to do with my intent. But if we take something that is a lot less, has a lot more uncertainty, a lot less certain, like whether it's going to rain tomorrow or not, or let's say even a week from now, whether it's going to rain a week from now or not, is even more uncertain. Now we start putting our intent on that, and we can modify that probability to increase it or decrease its raining. Or if we have a random number generator, we can put our intent to that to make the average of the random numbers creep up a little or down a little bit, because there's a little bit of uncertainty. And in a random number generator, the uncertainty is that if you have a random number generator and it just generates between 0 and 1, and therefore the average is going to be 0.5, right? That's going to be our average, is 0.5. So if you actually do that with an event-based random number generator, event-based means it's not a pseudo-random number. It's a real random number. It usually has a little piece of radioactive material, and depending on how the particles get thrown out, in the radiation, it makes a 0 or a 1. So that's a binary. So you can have some kind of event-based random number generator, and you can have a little uncertainty, because if you ran, let's say, 100 numbers and took the average, you probably wouldn't get 0.5. You'd probably get 0.4998 or 0.5001. There's a little uncertainty about what will come out of that. It's not you're not 100% sure. You couldn't run, say, 10 numbers and expect them to average to exactly, 0.50000000. It wouldn't be that case. So there is uncertainty with what you're going to get. And if you can build on that uncertainty, you can make a random number come out within that uncertainty just a little more often, a little higher, or a little lower, you see, within that uncertainty. So within the bounds of that natural uncertainty of the problem, you can modify it. So as you spend some time, you spend a minute or two thinking about this collection of numbers, if you can bias it just a little bit over time, well, you can make that number come out a little higher. So instead of 0.5, it's a 0.5001. And you say, well, okay, that's not much of a change. That's pretty small. But then you can do it again. And it comes out 50001. And then you do it again and again. And let's say you do that 10 times, and every time it comes out 0.5001 or 0.50003 or something like that, a little higher. Well, you could make it a little higher or you could make it a little lower. Those are the only two. It's a binary. It's either going to be a little higher, it's going to be a little lower, or it's going to be exactly 0.5 with, 50 zeros after it. Very unlikely, but it'll be small. But with that binary, making it come out high, even though it's only a 0.5001, it's high. But if I make it high every one of those 10 times, that's equivalent to flipping a coin and having it come up heads every time, 10 times in a row. Well, now that's big. You see, that tiny little 0.0001 wasn't much because the uncertainty we have to deal with isn't much. But to be able to make it high 10 times in a row, now that's one in probably, I don't know what getting 10 heads in a row would be, but it's probably like 1 in a million or some kind of real, big probability like that. And if you can do it 100 times in a row, or even 100 times, or even 95 times out of 100, now your probability is up into the tens of millions to 1 that you just did that by accident. So even though the result is small, it can create a very large statistical significance when you repeat the experiment. So that's what was done at Pear Labs, and that's how they did that. And they calculated that their significance statistic, that is what was the probability that they could have gotten all these answers just by chance. And it was, less than 1 in a billion that they could have gotten the results they got just by chance. So that's how the intent works. At first, you have to look at the native uncertainty around a certain event, like whether it'll rain or whether the sun will shine, or whether your random number will be a tiny bit more or a tiny bit less than the exact dead center. And then you work within that, and that will build. So when you look at the results of 1,000 random numbers, if you make most of those, say 90% of them, just a little high, well, all that just a little highs will start to add. You see, there'll be a whole bunch of just a little highs, and now your average will start to creep up. So that's how these experiments work. And another thing to kind of add to this, as far as something that's well known in our culture, and that's the placebo effect. The placebo effect works through intent. It's what you tell a person. It's the information that you give a person will tend to change the result that person finds. Placebo effect is usually done with health. You tell people that the pill they're going to take is going to make them better. They believe it. They have a positive attitude toward it. The doctor has a positive attitude toward it. And about, 35, 40%, well, get significantly better, healthier. Not just because they're pretending they're healthier or they feel better, but because they really are. tests will show that they're healthier against a control group that didn't get that information. So then again, the statistical significance between the test group and the control group shows that the placebo effect is a real thing. So this idea about using your intent to modify future probability has been tested and measured in lots of ways. Matter of fact, it's so reliable that most countries have laws that say you can't market a drug unless that drug first beats the placebo effect. In other words, it can have a higher cure rate than just the placebo effect. So we even our institutions take this idea that you can modify future probability with your intent into account. So it's a real thing, but it doesn't mean that just anybody can sit down and manifest what it is they want. There's constraints. One of the constraints is how much uncertainty is there about it. And second, how strong is your intent? Is it in the intellectual space and a wish? Well, not much will happen. So those are the variables, and that's why everybody won't be as effective, with it. Some people who practice will be much better at this than people who don't. And even people that practice will not get it right sometimes, just because sometimes their mind is busy or thinking about other things, or they do have stray thoughts. So it's not even 100% for people who do practice.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And it already led into my next question. So my next question relates to our worldview and how it plays into the process of intent creating reality. For me, worldview is like a large package of beliefs that we hold about the world and how it works. Many of our beliefs have become so deeply embedded in our psyche that we are probably not even aware of them, as we consider them as unquestionable and self-evident. We could probably say that this lens of our worldview has significant influence on the previously mentioned aspects of interpretation and interaction when it comes to co-creating our reality. But I would like again to focus today on the intent that is at play here. Would you agree that every human being, even those who believe that their intent has no influence on reality, has a fundamental and very powerful intent to always have the world behave in a way that confirms the validity of their worldview? And is this basic intent to have our worldview confirmed by our life experience something that you would allocate on the intellectual or on the being level?
Well, it'd be on some of both. We're a mixture, but just I agree with what you said. That's true. People have this worldview. This worldview modifies their intention. The intention is there, as you said, that to justify and support the beliefs that we have in our worldview. So we do have an intention that things come out the way we expect them to come out. There are expectations. For the average person, most of that is probably intellectual. Well, I should say some of that, of course, is intellectual and not a very strong intuitive change of future probability. But on the other hand, these beliefs are not intellectual beliefs. These beliefs are part of one's being level. It is what is at the core of you. So these beliefs really reside in that intuitive space. These are not intellectual things that we have intellectually decided are true. These are things that we just accept at the being level. So from that perspective, many of them do have stronger influence on the way things happen because the belief is at the being level, and just the feeling and expectation of that belief is also at the being level. Now, an average person's mind is not that coherent in the sense that it's got random thoughts running around in it a lot. So that makes it a weaker vehicle for modifying future probability, but it's still going to modify future probability a little. It's and if you have a lot of people with the same worldview, like you have in a culture, because a culture is kind of defined by its worldview, then you'll have a lot of people who are creating the reality that is, that is in consonance with their expectations of the way reality is. So they'll tend to create that. And even if they're all not real strong, but adding a little, well, it all adds up, because you have lots and lots of people that this modifying reality with your intent adds. So if you have two people trying to modify reality in the same way, then they'll be twice as effective together than if it was just one of them. You see, so it is additive. So if you have, 50 million people doing this, even if they're only working at, 20% efficiency, that's still an awful lot of push in that same direction. And this is what creates culture. And this is what creates a lot of the resistance in culture to change.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And I have one more follow-up in the same direction. So I've recently read several books on propaganda and mass media. Edward Bernays was a psychologist who was born in 1891, and Walter Lippmann was a journalist and author born in 1889. Both have developed theories on how to influence public perception through propaganda. Particularly Lippmann postulates that all humans can either react to reality itself or to the mental images about reality which they hold in their mind. Lippmann thought that in order for democracies to work properly, the population had to be helped to think in the right way. His approach was to use mass media in order to manipulate the mental images people hold about reality, and then to make sure their reactions were based on these manipulated mental images and not on reality itself. The mass media had a so-called gatekeeper function by deciding how to frame events and how to make sure contradictory information got systematically suppressed. Books which were written about Lippmann and his theories confirm that his approach was successfully used by many Western democracies over the last 100 years. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, they had to work with print media like newspaper and radio broadcasts, but with the invention of television, this introduced a whole new tool set of applying these methods. My next question is related to the deeper metaphysical aspects of this manipulation. Lippmann was basically interested in social science, media science, and politics, and how to make sure the population thought correctly so that the main agenda could be achieved. This could be seen as a purely materialistic concept of stimulus and response. But what about the deeper effects? Large groups of population could be manipulated at this deep level of mental images which for the most part are unconscious, similar to our worldview. Could this manipulation actually have a direct effect on reality itself by hijacking the unconscious intent of having our worldview confirmed, which we talked about in our previous question? If the majority of a population could be manipulated into a particular mindset, how would that mindset affect reality on a deeper level than just behavior? Could future probabilities get manipulated by steering collective intent into a particular direction using mass media?
Yes, indeed they could. Okay, the key here, the connection that I think you're looking for is what you mentioned earlier, and that is that we create, one of the ways we create our own reality is by our interpretation of the information we get. Okay? And that interpretation is our reality. In other words, we get information, and if you're a materialist, we'll say we get it through our five senses, but then we interpret that data that we get through our senses to be our reality. Okay, so our reality is not the world out there. Our reality is the world inside. So when you made the comment that people were to not focus on the world out there, but were to be manipulated by an interior world, well, those two are actually the same thing. Both worlds occur in mental space. That world out there that we see out there is our interpretation of the data we receive. So those two aren't really separate things. That world out there is the interpretation of the data we see. It's not the data, it's the interpretation of the data. That's why 5 people standing on the exact same street corner looking at an accident on the opposite street corner all see it differently. You get 5 different accident reports from all 5 of those people based on how they interpret the data. And how they interpret that data is based on their own, their own information base, their beliefs, their worldview, their attitudes. If one of them is somebody who really has a very hard attitude toward reckless young drivers, and there's an accident and one of the drivers happens to be young, they will tend to put that young driver at fault. That will be their fault. Whether it was or not, it's irrelevant. It's not what happens that creates the reality. For them, the reality will be that it was that young driver's fault. A movie of the situation may prove otherwise, but that would be a different reality than the one of this, particular individual. So yes, how we interpret the data, and if that data is given to us to lead us to a particular interpretation, where the information we get is filtered such that we end up with the conclusion that they want us to end up with, then indeed it makes us create a reality that is different than what we would see, than the reality we would live in if we weren't fed that biased data. Indeed, it does change our reality. Reality isn't a thing out there. Reality is in our minds. That's where reality lives. It's in our minds. So, no, what we think doesn't change the stuff out there. It doesn't make, the big tree suddenly become a small tree because we have a belief that all trees are small. It's not that way. But it'll make us look at a tree and see it as smaller than perhaps it really is, because we have a prejudice toward trees being small. And we will remember it being small, whether it really was or not, because our memory will have to be in consonance with our beliefs. So now we live in a world that's mainly made of small trees because of that bias. So that's probably not a really good example, but you have the idea that our reality is an inside thing, not an outside thing. It's what we make of it is what's important. Surely we can be led to believe all sorts of things, and that just changes our reality. And we see a lot of that today, in that because social media has such a strong influence today, because most everybody uses social media. It's the way they keep up with each other. It's the way they interact with their family. But that social media, now that it has taken so much data on us, it knows what our interest is. And it makes money by us being online. If we're not online, then it can't make any money from our choices. But if we are online, it can make money from our choices, because it gets paid whenever we click on one of its ads. So the more time we spend there, the more we click. Well, the social media has tried to manipulate us to keep us online more. And one of the ways it has done that is that it tends to show people what they believe. So now we start living in these bubbles, these manufactured bubbles. So people like me, it's collected a lot of data on me, and it knows my preferences. It sends me stories only that play to those preferences. And it sends me stories about not me, other people, the other people that will aggravate me or anger me or get me upset, because if I'm upset and really stirred up, I'll spend more time online to keep plugged in and see what's going on, and that keeps me online. So it'll send me things that will hook me emotionally. And that emotional is usually fear, is how you hook people. So it's going to show me that others are doing terrible things and are really stupid and whatever, just because that will keep me emotionally tied to staying plugged in. And it'll show those others that people like me are understand things that are really stupid, and it gets them upset. So it creates this polarization. And now we look at people and say, gee, how could you vote for that guy? You know, you must be stupid. You'd have to really be stupid to do that. And they're looking at us and saying the exact same thing, because we live in two different realities. You see, it's not that those people are stupid. It's their reality is just different than our reality. The reality they live in is very different. And from their viewpoint, from their reality, and the facts, quote unquote, you know, that's this, as you say, the filtered information they get, then people like me are just really, really stupid, because we don't seem to get those facts. And from our viewpoint, those things they think are facts aren't facts at all. So you see what happens is we get polarized, and we have sets of people living in the same country, shopping in the same stores, walking around with all the same stuff there, like the trees and the rain and all of that, yet living in two totally separate realities, and angry with each other, because that anger, that fear, sucks people in to be connected. You see, and if it sucks you in to be connected, well, you spend more time online, which means you're more likely to click on one of those ads, and the social media company gets paid. So yes, you know, that's just a very current, very, you know, obvious demonstration on exactly, you know, what you're asking about. That is exactly how it works. And, you know, it's doing that all over. You know, it's not just where I live, but it's where you live too. You know, the social media is playing those kinds of games with us for its own profit, and creating divergent, competitive, hostile reality frames within the culture, because that maximizes the profits of those social media companies.
Okay, thank you for the answer. I have a short question related to intuition. For me, intuition is a powerful tool to check if something is true or false, especially in a society where propaganda is used to steer populations' behavior. People have to be moved away from their intuition and educated to only trust an external arbiter of truth. How do you see the current role of our intuition in society? And how do you think this might change in the future, maybe even as a result of harmful developments during the current crisis, which were rolled out by those external arbiters of truth?
Well, you know, intuition is really a good thing if you develop it to be accurate and to be reliable. If your intuition is informed by your beliefs, if your intuition is informed by your fears, by your ego, then your intuition is just a little parrot that's going to parrot back to you what it is you believe. You know, it's going to tell you all those things you believe. But if your intuition is independent of those things, if your intuition can get outside of those things, then your intuition actually can be part of the solution. Your intuition can say, yeah, that's what I read, but no, I'm not buying it, because your intuition tells you that that doesn't sound right. Are all those people really that stupid? You know, all of those people really that stupid? That's hard to believe. There's something else going on here. My intuition says, no, that's probably not what's going on. Something else is happening other than just half the population, you know, are morons. You know, well, that's not true. half the population are not morons. There's something else going on. So then your intuition can help lead you toward the truth or seeing a bigger picture. So intuition, I see, is a good thing. It tends to be something that kind of nags at your mind because it's not quite at ease with the obvious, quote unquote, the obvious conclusion. There's something about it doesn't seem right. So the intuition can steer you right there. And if your intuition is gained from you getting data from a database, from a non-physical database, if you use your intuition to get that sort of data, then it's going to be very accurate, and it can be very reliable if you develop your mind to be able to do that. Okay, so that intuition can be a large part of the solution. But if all your intuition is doing is mirroring your own biases, then that intuition, I wouldn't even call that intuition. That's maybe something else. That's just your feelings substantiating what you believe is true. And I wouldn't even call that intuition. That's just another level of self-deception, or self-integration, where you have feelings about things, and if those feelings all support what you think is true, then it just makes your belief in it all that much stronger. So intuition, I think, is a real thing. The intuitive side is a side that should be strong and accurate. But if you run your life out of your fear, and when I say run your life, if the choices you make in your life are informed by your fear and by your beliefs and by your ego, then there's really, you're not really in touch. Your intuition isn't going to work. You won't be able to get data out of those databases. Those databases will be out of your ability to reach, because too much fear, too much ego, too many beliefs, you can't get there. And if you get rid of that fear and get rid of that ego and get rid of those beliefs, then your intuition can give you wonderfully correct and accurate data. So just depends on, where this intuition is rooted. If it's rooted in fear, it's going to be part of the problem. If it's not rooted in fear, it should be part of the solution.
Okay, thank you. We seem to experience more and more division lines running through society as a result of the current global crisis. There are different camps on how severe the situation is, and there is no agreement on the necessity, effectiveness, or even negative side effects of certain measures. When people quote scientific research, even from reputable sources, it makes a big difference if the results of this research are aligned with the mainstream government narrative or if they oppose it. We just had a case here in Germany where the head of a Bavarian public health office near Augsburg was removed from office because he criticized the measures of the government. He is a doctor and an epidemiologist, and he simply pointed out that there is not enough scientific evidence in favor of certain measures of the government, and thus he voiced doubts about if they were reasonable. This was enough to have him removed from office. There have been other cases where scientists voicing concerns which questioned the mainstream government narrative were immediately labeled as irrelevant by politicians and the media, despite having received multiple positive recognitions in often decades of work in the fields they were talking about. If the government gets to decide which scientist is worthy to be believed and which scientist is out of line and needs to be silenced, we are on a questionable path. Any discussion between opposing scientists is avoided by the mainstream camp, as they are right anyway because the government listens to them. In a way, science seems to throw its own principle overboard to have a scientific discourse and hear contradictory voices in order to drill down to the truth, and replace this process by belief. How do you perceive this situation? Might this global crisis expose science as yet another religion that is just using objectivity as a smokescreen?
Yeah, well, that would be one way to put it, yes. But I'd really put it another way, and that is scientists are people too. Scientists are not, they don't rise above humanity just because they're scientists. Scientists, like everybody else, have their own beliefs, their own attitudes. They're manipulated by social media, just like everybody else. They're not special little people who are not affected by the manipulation that is in their culture. They are affected by it. And as we've discussed earlier, this manipulation does tend to color their sense of reality. Now, you have politicians who are not so much interested in the truth as they're interested in getting their way. And their way, of course, in their own mind is the right way. So just like Walter Lippmann, he wasn't trying to manipulate people just to do whatever he wanted. He was trying to manipulate them into the right way, which of course was what he wanted to do. You see, it was what was his way. So we have politicians and others, people in the media, and whatever way they see is right, then they have no compunctions about manipulating everybody else to agree with them. And now when it comes particularly to politicians, not so much the media, if that also tends to give them power, like they get voted in and they get re-voted in, then there's power in controlling people. Now it's not just trying to manipulate people to agree with them. It's manipulating people to provide them a power base. Now that's a different thing altogether. So if you had a politician who was fundamentally interested in the country in which he served, and it was that country's best interest, and also serving the people of that country, in other words, the government of the people, for the people, and by the people, if it was about the people and what's best for them, then you would have a worthy politician, someone who was really earning their pay and doing the right thing. But we have very few of those. Mostly politicians, number one goal in life is to get reelected or to get appointed to more powerful positions. It has to do with control and power. And if you have control and power, it allows you to use force in making it your way. And unfortunately, that's been an attitude drift over the last, 100 years that is still going on today. We're still drifting that way. Basically, it's a letting go of the fundamental ethics and the fundamental morality of what's right and wrong. We, in 100 years back, the word collegiate, if you had a college, that meant people who had differing views and ideas, and they were all allowed to voice those and argue with each other. And it was all about the best ideas competing. And how did your idea get more people to agree with that than an opposing idea? And it was this kind of, we say marketing of ideas, but the ideas go out into the idea space, and then people argue about them, and some rise up and some fall down. Doesn't mean the ones that are on top are actually the best ideas. It just means they're the most popular at the time, which has a lot to do with culture and not just science, as we said. But at least it was polite, and everybody was welcome to their opinion, no matter how off the wall that opinion was. All viewpoints supposedly were tolerated. That's the general collegiate viewpoint. It's a collegiate atmosphere when all viewpoints are welcomed. Well, we are, we're not so inclusive anymore. We've kind of left that ethic of openness and of including everyone behind. And we tend to now be about us. We're a little more self-centered that way, in that our ideas are the right ideas, and people who disagree with us are obviously wrong, rather than the people who disagree with this, well, they just have a different opinion. Not that they're wrong, they just don't see it the way we do. They're a competing idea. They're competitors of ours. And we don't mind competing with them because we think our idea is good. But see, there's a little difference between those two opinions, whether we welcome competitors or whether we want to get rid of our competitors. We want to shut our competitors down. And today we tend to want to shut our competitors down. We're more exclusive. Our sense of being ethical and letting everybody come to the conversation is disappearing. Well, it's not gone, but it's just not as prevalent in our culture. Just as is, at least in my culture, I don't know if it's true in the German culture, but in my culture, when I was very young, to tell a lie was a very bad thing. Lying was wrong, and if you were caught in a lie, you were severely punished, even if the lie was not all that, didn't cause all that much trouble. Just because it was a lie, you were severely punished. Truthfulness was always the best way to be under any circumstance, even if you were the one that had done the wrong thing. Being truthful about it was very important. Now, in my culture, lying is seen as clever. If you tell a lie and get your way, well, you're just clever. And that person that you just tricked, well, he's a chump. He deserves that because he just wasn't clever enough. So lying and cheating are seen as clever ways, hacking the system. It's a ways of getting around things. That's, again, an emphasis on, being self-centered. So that's probably changed. And you pointed out that a lot has changed since TV came into all our households. TV is a much more powerful propaganda tool than was radio. Radio was a pretty big propaganda tool because it talked to so many people at the same time. But TV is even a much bigger and much better and talks to more people. So with that, unscrupulous people who don't really have very good ethics and are more self-centered have used that to manipulate other people, get other people to act and believe the way they act and believe. And that seems to have gotten worse and worse. Now we have the internet. And the internet is sort of a free space in ways, and that's anybody can go post on the internet. But also, that opens us up to a lot of silliness and a lot of wildness. And we have to learn to accept that. That has to be part of it. We need to accept it, but we also have to be wise enough to see through it. You see, not to have our mind captured by every conspiracy theorist to, make something up. We have to be able to look at that and say, that doesn't make sense. Or, well, even if it does make sense, it doesn't really have anything to do with me. I'm not going to get excited about that. So that's the level of maturity in dealing with information that we have not yet developed. And I think part of it is just time. We've moved from the industrial age into the information age. We have more information now than we've ever had. And there's really very little restraint on that information. It just is everybody's saying whatever it is they want to say. Some people are more powerful than others because they have bigger audiences than others. But now we have to learn how to sort all that, how to deal with it, not get captured by it. And we're really not very good at that yet. People are not very practiced at looking at all that information and being able to critically assess it. That's a problem. Now, maybe 100 years from now, when we've had a whole century of the information age, we'll be much cleverer about processing that information. And we'll maybe have some rules and strictures on lying, say. over that information, on people trying to deceive other people. Maybe we'll have some constraints there, but now we don't. So it's the wide open jungle right now in the information space, and we're ill-adapted to deal with it. And because of that, many people are led off into strange realities that they have created for themselves because they believe that these realities are real, and that's all it takes to be real for them, is a belief. So I don't know that there's an easy solution to this other than our laws. Laws are always very slow to come into effect. It's only after you've had a problem for many, many decades before we get around to making laws to try to settle some of that out. Like it wasn't until there was a lot of problem with people not carrying through on contracts that we have laws. So you sign a contract and there's legal things that have to do with that contract that you can't just say, nah, I don't want to abide by that contract anymore. Well, there's legal ramifications now to saying that. Before there wasn't. You go back, before commerce was a big thing. Well, if you were just bigger and had more force than the other guy, you could just welch on your contract, and so what? What are you going to do about it? See, so we grew up, and now we have a legal system that protects people, even little people who aren't big. They still can go to court and win their case because there's laws. Well, we don't have a lot of laws about, say, lying and manipulating people, on the internet or over TV, because it's all new. It's just been in the last 100 years, not even 100 years, the last 60 years or so that it's been a thing. Well, that's not enough for our laws or even our awareness to catch up with it. So that's part of the problem. And I don't see a solution here for a little bit of time. And of course, we've got to get through it until we find solutions. And that's a little tricky right now because socially we're so polarized that we can't even talk to each other anymore. You only talk to those people that live in the same bubble you live in. They live in your reality and you interact with them. And other people who aren't in your reality, you can't even have a conversation with them because there's so much anger, so much investment in their beliefs. And you have a lot of investments in your beliefs. So, how to solve the problem? How do we all get together and solve a problem when we can't even talk to each other? That's a difficult place to be in. But we will sort it out, Give us enough time further down the road, it will sort out, and there will be constraints, there'll be regulations, there'll be rules, and we'll be a lot smarter at critical thinking. Right now, critical thinking isn't important in anybody's curriculum. We don't teach our children that. I mean, critical thinking ought to be a part of the curriculum from kindergarten up. Every grade ought to spend some time on critical thinking. How do you tell facts from opinion? But we don't. Well, I suspect that in the future we will, because it's going to be an important part of our survival that we're able to do that. It hasn't been. 100 years ago, critical thinking wasn't that important because our world was so small, and it moved so slow that it really didn't matter too much. But now our world is it's more interconnected than ever, and it moves very fast. And critical thinking has become a survival need that we need to have in the information age. So we'll learn, we'll grow. We're just in a tight spot now that's going to be a little touch and go until we work our way out of it.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So my last question is actually not from me. It's from somebody who watched many of the videos I translated into German. And he told me, well, Tom says many times that reality is not objective. And his question was, what are the consequences for our daily lives if reality actually is not objective?
Well, we've just been talking about a lot of those consequences. Reality is in the mind, of the player. If we get back, if we're talking my theory now, and not just in general terms, this is a virtual reality. Every player, is attached to an avatar, which is their body. And the reality exists only in the minds of the players. There is no hard physical reality out there. There is no objective reality. Reality is all subjective. It's all in the minds of the players, period. So from that viewpoint, flows all the things we've just talked about. It's subjective. It's what, your reality is what you interpret it to be. You get to modify it with your intention. And actually what happens is the vector sum of all of those intentions, pushing and pulling in all which ways. That's what happens. That's why that the reality that we actually get, read the news, look outside your window, what's out there? What do you see? What you see and what's out there is the vector sum of all the things that we've done, that we've created, the choices that we've made. We make choices. So we live in a reality that is an exact portrayal of the quality of the choices we humans make. So that's where we live. And until we make better choices, that reality is not going to get any better. So we can replace this dictator and we can get rid of that politician and we can, get better people in charge of those things, but it'll all go back to just the way it was eventually, unless we change our quality of who we are. So what difference does it make to us that it's not an objective world? All the difference, everything. There is no objective world out there that is the real world and the right world. There's only a subjective world of interpretation, of intent, and of interaction. Now, it is a multiplayer game. So because it's a multiplayer game, you do not control everything. It's not like you make your reality completely. You don't. I think that's solipsism, I think. Isn't that right? Where solipsistic idea that you're the only real thing that exists and everything else is made up from yourself. It's not like that at all. There's other players playing other avatars, and they're making choices. And the choices they make affect you, and the choices you make affect them. And within all of this interaction, out comes a result, and that's the world we live in. It's a result of all of those choices, and if those choices are low quality, come from low quality consciousness, and are low quality choices, like choices that are self-centered, that are greedy, that want to control people, that want to manipulate information, that want to, separate the polarized people in order to make more money, then that's the world we live in. And we just have to individually grow up. So there is no objective world. And even if you say, well, let's define this physical universe as objective, and then our consciousness as subjective. So we have the inside world and the outside world, and that outside world is objective. It's only the consciousness, the mind, that is subjective. That outside world is objective. Well, even that is not true. That outside world can never be specified without error. There's always uncertainty in that outside world. You can't measure anything to 100 decimal places, probably. You can only measure to the accuracy of the equipment you're using to measure. After that, it's uncertain. So how long is, how long is this brick? How heavy is this brick? How much volume does it have? Well, that brick is an objective thing. Here's a brick. I see a brick. You see a brick. We all see a brick. But we all see it a little differently. And if each one of us measures it, we'll all get a little different answer down in that last decimal place that you have to guess at because your equipment doesn't really tell you what it is. We'll all kind of guess a little at the end of that measurement. So we don't really know. There's uncertainty everywhere. So the things that we call objective are things that come with naturally have, I should say, little uncertainty. They're things that just naturally have little uncertainty. And the things that we call subjective are things that have a lot of uncertainty. That's why we talked about in the beginning that you can change things if there is some natural uncertainty. You need a little natural uncertainty. But if the probability is 1 that a thing is like that, well, then it's like that. You can't change it. No matter how much intent you put on it, it's probability's 1. You're not going to do anything about that. But if it's only 0.99999, well, there's a little room to work there. Not much, but a little. And if it's 0.5, 50-50, well, it's not that hard to change it, to make it be, say, 40-60 is not all that hard. So what we think of as the objective world, it's simply those things in our reality that have a naturally small amount of uncertainty. And what we think about the things that are subjective are those things that have a naturally larger amount of uncertainty. And that's really the way you solve those. But everything is really subjective, even the measurement of that brick. So that's kind of the split on this. What's objective and what's subjective, and how does everything being subjective affect us? Well, everything being subjective is the way it is. That's the reality we live in. That's why we're able to now live with, the people next door live in a totally different reality than I live in. They see things completely differently. Their facts are a whole different set of facts. I look at their facts and I say, that stuff's fiction. They look at my facts and they say my facts are fiction. We just live in different realities now. Information creates reality. Reality is information. If your information is not useful, doesn't work for you, creates more entropy, well, I guess not useful is the best thing. If you take your information and your beliefs and it just creates heartache and creates problems and difficulties and makes things worse, well, it's not good information. So, it may be impossible for us to tell whether my next door neighbor or my facts are the better facts. Who's got the right facts? Well, the one that has the right facts is the one that if you work on, if you live your life according to those facts and your life is full of happiness and joy and peace, and it's good for everybody, for not only for you but everybody around you. It's something that supports low entropy. Then those were good. That's good information that you can use. If you live according to another set of information and it causes misery and pain and unhappiness and difficulty and ends up in a large number of people being left out or, living very suboptimally, well, then that's not such good information. So we can judge that information instead of just arguing about the facts. We can look and see, where is it going to take us? Where does it go? Does it go to a place with a maximum amount of positivity, maximum number of people feel good or smiling every day? Or does it go to some other thing? That's basically the way you tell whether your information's good or not, because we can argue all day about the facts. Because I can tell my neighbor, I say, well, look, this guy did all these terrible things and you like him. And they'll say, oh, none of that stuff's true. That was all just made up. That's all fake news. And he tells me, and I tell him the same thing. He shows me, yeah, but see, the guy I like has all these wonderful points. And I'll look at it and I'll say, that's all fake news. Well, neither one of us really knows what's going on. We both depend on other people to tell us because we're not there. We don't see it. We see pictures. We see videos. Well, pictures and videos can be faked. You can make anything look like anything. Video in videos, toasters and pigs can fly. It's you can't count on that. So who's right? Well, should my neighbor and I sit down and argue about who's right and who's wrong? He'll never convince me I'm wrong, and I'll never convince him that he's wrong, because we're both committed to our set of facts. Well, let's look at the facts and see where they're going to take us. Now, that's a discussion we can have. Where are these facts going to take us? And we can maybe actually find something there to disagree with some, with some analysis behind it. But even so, it's a tough place where we are now. It's really a tough place. And how do we claw back from, back out into the sunlight to where people aren't trying to manipulate us and we all just to make up our own mind? That would be nice, but we all depend on other people to tell us what's going on. None of us get firsthand information about most of what's going on outside of our own houses. We have firsthand information, but once it gets out of our house, then we don't have any firsthand information anymore. So we have to accept what people tell us. And my advice is to judge what people tell you based on how much peace, happiness, joy, and what goodwill, positivity is in that line of thinking, or how much sadness and unhappiness and control and misery and crying is in that line of thinking. Do your best. That's all you can do. You come to your own conclusions based on whether you think it's a high entropy path or a low entropy path.
Okay, Tom. Thank you very much for your time.
Yes, you're quite welcome. I'm afraid it's probably more time than you really want to have to translate, but I think we made a lot of good points that will be very useful to people. So I think it was very good.
I think so too. So thank you again.
Yeah, you're quite welcome, Oliver. Thank you.